The United Kingdom is drifting towards something far more authoritarian than most people are willing to admit, because the political system now has to juggle a country made up of many diasporic tribes, groups who legally possess the same standing as the native population, yet often possess none of the historical association with the country, different loyalties, instincts, interests. And a state like that cannot not stay easygoing forever. Eventually it's going to need tighter control simply to keep the whole thing working, which is why knowing your own history suddenly becomes more than a hobby, it becomes a duty. The ancient historian Thucydides described something remarkably similar during the Peloponnesian War. Writing about the civil strife in Corcyra, which is now modern-day Corfu, he observed how language itself began to collapse under political pressure. Words suddenly mean something different to what they once did. He writes, "Words had to change their ordinary meaning, and to take that which was now given them. Reckless audacity came to be considered the courage of a loyal supporter. Prudent hesitation, specious cowardice, moderation was held to be a cloak for unmanliness. Ability to see all sides of a question, incapacity to act on any. Frantic violence became the attribute of manliness, cautious plotting a justifiable means of self-defense." That passage could have been written yesterday about our own situation. You see the same inversion everywhere today. Moderation becomes cowardice, prudence becomes weakness, and merely asking questions becomes proof of your moral failure. But despite all that distance in time, there is still a line connecting us to the ancient world, and it's remarkably beautiful. Across 2,500 years of European history, through Rome, through the Middle Ages, through the birth of modern constitutional government, that thread survives. It links us not only to the Greeks, but to our European cousins as well. And this is why I love Europe. And I get frustrated by their misrepresentation through the EU, which offers the same rot as our own government. Let's look how our rot manifests. For over 800 years, it has been one of the central protections of English liberty that was articulated in the Magna Carta, when the Crown was forced to recognise that no free man could simply be imprisoned or stripped of rights at the whim of their authority. And I quote, "except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the land." It was one of the foundations of the entire English legal tradition. And today, we have politicians casually discussing the removal of juries from parts of the legal process, as if it were merely an administrative inconvenience to be tidied away. Consider David Lammy, for example, a man born to Guyanese parents and raised in one of the most demographically transformed parts or enriched parts of London. Whatever his personal merits, the historical inheritance of England is not something that shaped him in the same way it shaped generations before him. And I think that matters. Because when you are deciding whether to dismantle institutions that took centuries to build, the question of what you feel a duty to preserve becomes very important. The same pattern appears in discussions about slavery reparations. Lammy's argument, put simply, is that when Britain abolished slavery, it compensated the slave owners rather than the slaves themselves, and therefore some historical debt remains unpaid. But the reality is more complicated than that. The British government effectively purchased the freedom of enslaved people at enormous financial cost in order to force immediate abolition across the empire. And had the state simply demanded emancipation without compensation, the slaves, they would have most certainly have continued to be slaves for a considerable amount of time after, decades perhaps. So instead, Britain undertook one of the most aggressive abolitionist campaigns in world history, spending vast sums and deploying the Royal Navy to suppress the slave trade globally. Yet that legacy is frequently presented not as a moral achievement, but as some sort of further evidence of national guilt. And here we arrive at the deeper problem. Other countries and other political groups can see quite clearly how unsure Britain has become about its own past and its own identity. When a population no longer understands its own historical foundations, it becomes extremely easy to reshape by others. You can tell people their civilization is uniquely wicked. You can tell them that their institutions are illegitimate, and you can even tell them that a demographic transformation is necessary on a scale that would once have been unimaginable. It's simply the outcome of democracy. But here is the awkward fact. Ever since democratic polling began in the subject on the subject of immigration in Britain, the public has consistently rejected the scale of migration being imposed upon it. And yet the demographic composition of the country has changed at extraordinary speed. A set of islands that were over 99% ethnically British little more than a century ago are now moving towards something far more fragmented and far more tribal. So the question naturally arises, how does a democracy justify such a transformation when the electorate repeatedly signals discomfort with it? That tension between what people have said for 70 years and what the system has delivered while calling itself a democracy is precisely the kind of doublespeak that Thucydides talks about in the core Syrian civil war. Marcus Tullius Cicero, a statesman who lived at the end of the Roman Republic, said, "To be ignorant of what occurred before you were born is to remain always a child." And multiculturalism was always, in my opinion, a very childish idea, fit for those who had not seen the world and who scarcely knew not only their own history but any history prior to the moral reset of the post-war period. So ask yourself this question. How much do you actually know about the history of your own country and your own people? And are you rooted in it? Or are you as transient as the political class that governs us? And they govern us not as a civilization, but more of a managerial project, something like a steel and glass airport terminal where the only metric is how much they can take from you. It is not just neglect. I consider it to be a betrayal. Because England is a living inheritance, and one that now dozens of MPs who occupy our shared institutions care very little about. It'll be Palestine or the war in Iran that gets them animated. England is just a vessel in which their own foreign priorities can be enacted. So if the political class, of whom most have just been naive, myopic natives, have accelerated this decay, imagine the state or the rate of destruction when those in power have no attachment to this country, who perhaps have only lived in London, where the historic population has already become a minority, and at a pace that there are very few parallels. Perhaps the only one I can think of is Constantinople after the Ottoman conquest. But here is the good news. For the first time in my life, there are movements that reject the idea that people from Iraq, Somalia, Eritrea will simply shed centuries of cultural inheritance and slot neatly into a civilization whose own people seem to reject. If we ourselves are confused about who we are and what this country is and what it took to build, expecting others to effortlessly assimilate is ludicrous. Civilizations, more often than not, don't get conquered like that of Carthage or Thebes. More often, they simply forget who they are. Not this country, not my country. Mos Maiorum.